Shabbat Shalom, everybody. This Shabbat is the Inclusion Shabbat that is a project run by the Los Angeles Jewish Federation. And as you may have seen in the Jewish Journal, I am only one of the rabbis speaking today about our community's continuing task to be inclusive of people with disability. And that happens to be a great fit with today's Torah portion, which I think is why they chose it. It's full of instructions about not mistreating the vulnerable and not exploiting the poor. But that's not where I want to be placing our focus today, even though that is worthy material. I have a much simpler question, and I owe my thanks to my esteemed senior rabbi sitting over there for helping me to formulate it. The question that I want to ask today is, why doesn't the Hebrew language have a word for normal? Why doesn't the Hebrew language have a word for normal? A proper word for normal, because Hebrew has borrowed from English in order to create this word at a particular level in the language. And if I were giving this sermon in Hebrew, I would say, but often normally, in the normal way, but often normally, this is the word normally that we use for normal. But you can hear that that is not a Hebrew word. That is a borrowing. And I'm asking, why doesn't Hebrew proper, Hebrew like my teacher of blessed memory taught me, why doesn't Hebrew proper have a word for normal? So I went to the dictionary. There's a great dictionary online called Morphix. And I went to the dictionary, and the dictionary, when I plugged in normal, gave me, of course, normali, which we're discarding, and also the options of the word ragil, resh gimel yud lamed, and the word takin, taf kuf yud nun. And ragil, as you can hear from its sound, is taken from the word for leg or foot, which comes to mean pace, which comes to mean habit, which comes to mean regularity, which comes to mean kind of sort of normal, but not really. And takin, like tikkun olam, means something that is whole or undamaged. And again, I'm going to suggest that that is not really a word for normal. Certainly, neither of those will work if we're going to have a conversation about disability. Incidentally, for disability, modern Hebrew uses the word lakui with a kuf, which has become part of the language. That's what you see in the street signs. And it's not a nice word, actually. It has strong connotations of being inadequate in some way. And lakui is much closer to the word that we used to use, which is, of course, the word handicapped. Now, the degree to which we are wedded to the idea that a conversation about disability has to begin with whether we notice it or not, a set of assumptions about what is or isn't normal, looks even odder when we consider the way that Judaism is. There is nothing normal about the Torah, nothing whatsoever. The 5 books are all of different sizes. The chronology is all over the shop. It begins at lightning speed, covering thousands and thousands of years in the book of Bereshit, Genesis, and then it puts on the brake and it slows down to a halt in time for the second half of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. The book of Vayikra, the middle book of the Torah, all takes place on a single day. And then, a little way into the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, time begins to run again, but 39 years mysteriously go missing and are never found. And so the Torah ends with a book that isn't a book at all, actually. The end of the Torah is at the end of the 4th book, when it comes to narrative. The whole of the final book is recapitulation, which is why the Greeks called it Deuteronomy or Deuteronomos, second law, second time law, except that the book of Deuteronomy is not a faithful repetition of everything that came before. And finally, and I think it clinches the argument, having spent most of itself leading up to the entry into the Promised Land, the Torah ends just before that happens. And we're left to the book of Joshua to actually get the end of the story. So if we're going to talk about normal, if we're even going to talk about regular, well, the Torah is not. And I want to suggest that irregularity is going to become the keynote of later Jewish tradition as well. If you'll pardon the pun, it's the norm. One of the first projects of the early rabbis was to gather the legal material that is scattered all over the Torah and add some comments about how that material should be put into practice, and to arrange it by topic so that you stand half a chance of finding what you're looking for, which we know is not the case with the Torah. And this work is called the Mishnah, and this work is also not normal. It's not consistent. A law code should not really be recording dissenting views unless it's going to decide what the norm is, and the Mishnah doesn't. And moreover, the Mishnah is so densely written that it immediately attracts extremely lengthy commentaries. That first commentary is called the Gemara, and the Mishnah and the Gemara are published together these days in what we know as the Talmud. And most of the time, what the Gemara seems to be doing is gleefully bringing back all the material that got left out of the Mishnah and using it to disprove what the Mishnah had to say in the first place. And that, as far as law codes go, is definitely not normal. And that pattern continues throughout Jewish legal history. I want to pause to acknowledge the passing this week just gone, of one of the great modern minds of Jewish law, the great scholars of halakha. His name was Menachem Elon, and his grasp of halakha was so extensive that the Israeli Supreme Court consulted with him regularly on matters concerning halakha. And it was Elon, I think I'm right in saying, who was the first to notice that throughout Jewish law, people come along periodically and try to tidy it up. Maimonides was one of those people. He wrote a book when he was 24. He was a genius. He called it Mishneh Torah, the second Torah, and the whole idea of Mishneh Torah was that you wouldn't need to go to any of the other books. You could go to this one book and you would be able to find everything, because that, if you want, was going to be the norm. And no sooner had the ink dried on the final period of the Mishneh Torah than other commentators begin jumping up and down and shouting things like, but you left this out, but that's wrong, but you're not quoting your sources. I have to write a really, really long book now just to show you how wrong you are, and it's going to disagree with most but not everything that you said. And now all of the future generations are going to have to use that book too. And then you get everybody pitching in with their opinions about real life. You have a whole literature of what are called teshuvot, answers, that come up to specific real life situations. And those answers have been rendered, those teshuvot, our earliest teshuvot are back to the 7th or 8th century probably, and teshuvot literature is alive and well and strong today. Not tidy, not regular, not normal. And even God isn't normal, not in the Jewish tradition. I checked the etymology of the word normal. The word normal means made according to a carpenter's square. You have to imagine normal as being everything just the same with tidy corners. Nothing could be further from the way our tradition understands God to be. There is a very famous piece of Mishnah, justifiably so, that we find in the section about law courts, which records in full the warning that judges used to give to witnesses in a case where somebody was being tried and, if convicted, could face the death penalty. The witnesses would be called in front of the judges, and they would be told in no uncertain terms that the life of the defendant was going to hang upon their words. Their testimony would decide whether the defendant lived or died. And then the warning went on, I quote, "And this is why human beings were created singly, to teach you that whoever destroys a single soul, Torah accounts it as if they had destroyed a whole world. And whoever saves one soul, Torah accounts it as if they have saved a whole world. And to declare the greatness of the Holy One, blessed be God. For when a human being stamps out coins with a die, all the human beings come out alike. But the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be God, stamped every human being with the seal of Adam, and not one of them is like another. And therefore each and every human being is obliged to say, for my sake the world was created. End quote. This is the antithesis of the carpenter's square. God is using a mold to create human beings. But even though the mold is the same mold, everything that comes out of that mold looks different. The mold is the mold of Adam, the first human being who was created, and we know, because the Torah teaches us so, that the first human being was created in whose image? God's. B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And that, not normal, but that is the concept that I think should stand front and center in any Jewish discussion of disability. Our tradition is teaching over and over again that there is no such thing as normal. Rather, every human being reflects its creator, and therefore, in whatever form and displaying whatever behavior, every single human being is a reflection of God. And so I ask myself how our Jewish community would look, and by this I should say I don't just mean synagogues, I mean our Jewish institutions, I mean our schools, I mean the campuses, I mean Hillel, I mean around the world. How would our Jewish communities look if we use that concept that every human being is in the image of God as a deciding principle for any conversation that we might want to have about disability? Well, first, I think we could hope for a climate of greater acceptance, because by definition, no one image of God is greater than or lesser than any other image of God. And so, when we plan our buildings, or when we set out our religious services, or our social functions, we can do so in a way that accepts and welcomes the variety of folk who we know are going to come through our doors, because God's image is manifest in many forms. Placing a mezuzah low down on the doorpost should be the rule rather than the exception. There should always be a ramp leading up to the bimah. I conducted a funeral this week. There was no ramp enabling people to come up and pass before the coffin. The ramp should be the rule, not the exception. The ramp is the accommodation of the image of God. And by the way, I think there is a trap here that we're going to fall into if we're not careful, because this is the point at which we might be prompted to leap out of our seats to help the disabled and come up with lots and lots of helpful ideas. And I'm not saying this isn't laudable. It is. That is the reaction that all of us should be having. We might very well want to get up and form a committee, but it's a trap. I want to suggest that if we think of inclusion in that way, we're still being driven by the idea of normal, because we're making special accommodations for the disabled. And I'm not sure that that's what our tradition wants to let us do. It wants us to go further than that. The task that we face is to develop what the writer Kathy Snow calls a culture of caring. And she points out that the reality of the lives of many people who have disabilities is that they're surrounded by professional carers. There are family members, there are service providers, there are therapists, educators, and so on. And those people help. They do. They definitely help. But it is a mistake, she says, to confuse help with caring. Because caring begins with paying attention to people's feelings and to what is going on inside the person. And she quotes somebody who I've not heard of, but whose book I want to buy. He's called Milton Mayerhoff. And he says, "To care for another person, I must be able to understand him and his world as if I were inside it, to see, as it were, with his eyes what the world is like to him and how he sees himself. Instead of merely looking at him in a detached way from outside, as if he were a specimen, I must be able to sense from inside what life is like for him, what he is striving to be, and what he requires to grow. And to care for each other's insides in the way that Snow is suggesting will help us create a community in which everybody belongs, in which we listen more than we talk, and in which there is no normal at all. Simply a shared potential for each member of that community to get what they need in order to create excellence. And a third thing that we can do, and we should do immediately, is to amend the language that we use. Each one of us can do this. The person should come first. So it's not an epileptic. It's a person with epilepsy. It's not a quad or a quadriplegic, but a person with quadriplegia. Not ADHD, but a person with learning differences. And we shouldn't roll our eyes when we're asked to change our language. Because by changing our habits in this way binds us to the idea of the Tselem Elohim, the image of God, and it reminds us that it should come first and then everything else will follow. And furthermore, we can change our speaking habits as of this moment, as of today. And we should. We should begin now. And so it seems to me that when it comes to folk with disabilities, the issue, Jewishly speaking, is not one of inclusion. I think that inclusion is one of those traps that I was talking about. Rather, when it comes to talking about disability in our communities, it should be for each and every one of us a process of reconnecting and remembering that our tradition does not go by ideas of what is normal and what is not normal, but instead proceeds from the basis that we are all made of the same stuff and we are all images of God, and that it is our sacred duty to see God in each other. And if we do that, we don't need the word inclusion anymore. I want to leave you with a picture that you can take home and think about. This week in our Jewish learning community, the 6th grade participated in the Jewish wedding. This is exactly what they do. Everybody gets a role. We have a lot of kids, so we had 2 weddings on Tuesday. And the kids who are becoming, they're just on the point of not becoming kids anymore. But I can call them kids because I'm the rabbi. And the kids take a role: rabbi, parent, musician, bride, groom. And in that way, they learn by doing how our tradition understands how the lives of 2 people become bound together. And if you asked one of our brides this year, she would tell you that she's a person with a learning difference. That's the language that she chooses to use. But if you were to ask one of her classmates, he would tell you that she's the one with the beautiful smile. And I'm ready to bet that she made a beautiful bride. And I want to suggest that we would do well to follow that example. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.